split up the talk between Cora and I. So we thought we'd start with just a brief poll here. Quick visual. If you could stand or raise your hand if you love the Great Lakes. Yes? Through your research, your recreation, whatever. And then keep your hand up or stand. No one wants to stand. Come on, guys. 3 o'clock. Okay, you got your hand up. You love the Great Lakes. Keep your hand up if you're concerned about climate disruption. And keep it up longer if you know that in order to address climate disruption, we need to stop combusting fossil fuels. Okay, thank you. That's a nice backdrop to the motivation behind this topic. And, you know, it would be perfectly fine if your love for the Great Lakes and the need to find alternatives to combusting fossil fuels were completely aligned. But what if in our quest for finding alternatives, we needed to turn to the lakes and the wind power in the lakes, and there are resource conflicts? How are we going to assess that? How do we know what the right way is to proceed? These are questions that all need research if we're going to move forward. So with that, I'm going to show you, we're going to talk about why we're researching GLOW, Great Lakes Offshore Wind. I'll talk a little bit about the School of Freshwater Sciences Water Consulting Experience course, which Isaac referenced as the practicum. It has a new title for spring. The NSF workshop that we just did, some research that Cora and I have been pursuing at the Center for Water Policy, and next steps and open research questions. So first, why GLOW? Climate disruption is growing, as is international agreement that we need to produce energy from renewable sources. And how do we do this on a massive scale in the time needed? The National Renewable Energy Lab did an assessment of the Great Lakes wind energy potential, and 5 of the 8 Great Lakes states could meet all of their statewide energy demands, electricity demands, by renewable power from offshore wind. In theory, there's a whole bunch of technology problems, a whole bunch of assumptions built into their model. So that's, you know, very, very much inflated. It's theoretical. In reality, the Great Lakes wind potential to contribute to the regional energy grid mix and economic growth in the region also will only be realized if there's a legal framework in which to develop that untapped renewable source in a way that benefits society and the environment. So we have government policies at the federal level promoting 30 gigawatts of offshore wind as a goal by 2030. Most of the proposals for offshore wind and also realized proposals have been clustered off the northeastern coast, the Atlantic Ocean coast. And states in that region have proactively encouraged the industry with state level goals of energy procurement, some of them specific to offshore wind. So all of the 8 Great Lakes states do have some type of energy goal in state law, and 5 have 100% renewable energy goals by set dates ranging from 2040 to 2050. So that's a fairly tight time frame for most of the Great Lakes states. There's been quite a bit of talk about Great Lakes offshore wind from some of our neighboring states in Illinois, for instance, and Michigan and Ohio. But nothing has been realized yet. We have no turbines on the water yet. So we're at the infancy of this. So that leads me to the water consulting course here at the school. In spring of 2023, this team of interdisciplinary students that included students not only from SFS and atmospheric sciences, but from other departments across campus, worked together for a public client. The client was the city of Milwaukee's eco office, and they assessed the feasibility of putting offshore wind turbines off the coast of Milwaukee. Now, this is completely theoretical. Milwaukee has no plans for developing offshore wind. I'll say that at the outset. But this was a very cool hands-on project that the students got through the consulting class. And it got some notice because SFS wrote a news story about this and posted it on our website. And that happened in the summer of 2023, at the same time that the National Science Foundation was putting out this Dear Colleague letter call for proposals on clean energy workshops. So a potential collaborator from Madison saw the SFS story when he saw this call for proposals, and he reached out to me to see if I would participate in planning this workshop. And that led to the Center for Water Policy, Cora and I, being involved in planning the workshop. Here you see all the different topic areas that were involved in putting together this proposal. We had representatives, or co-PIs rather, from not only UWM and UW-Madison, but from the University of Minnesota, Michigan Tech, the National Renewable Energy Lab, and the Pacific Northwest National Lab, who all participated as project leads in this. We did have to talk outside of our disciplinary silos in order to put together just this proposal for the workshop, which we did in the fall of 2023. And it took a lot of waiting throughout the fall and winter, a lot of prodding by the PI to NSF to see what was happening with this. So it's really good to partner with someone who is willing to keep staying involved and moving things forward with the representatives at the federal agencies. Ultimately, the proposal was selected and we started working on the workshops. And so it was a pretty interesting process divided into two parts. In August of this summer, we did virtual workshops. Each of those areas with these topics had virtual workshops. Ours was on the law and policy panel, and Cora and I invited the workshop presenters. We had people attending from all over the country, including proponents of who were industry reps, I should say, of offshore wind on the oceans came to this, along with academics and practitioners in energy and agency representatives. But virtual workshops all fed into then the in-person workshop that happened in Madison in September. And here we were all, it was a smaller group than we could accommodate with the virtual session, and it was all hands-on working together cross disciplines to break out of our silos and discuss the results of the virtual panels, ultimately leading to what we'll produce out of this is a report that articulates for the federal government the open research questions about Great Lakes offshore wind, and perhaps seed some ideas for future grants that requests for proposals that come out of the federal government. So Cora and I led the sessions at both the virtual and the in-person workshop on law and policy. And at this point, I'm going to talk about some of the key legal issues related to offshore wind and the open research questions, and then I'll turn it over to Cora. So while we were pursuing the workshop funding and planning for the workshops, we were also simultaneously pursuing a research agenda at the Center for Water Policy, and we put together 2 law review articles, one that was published this summer in the Notre Dame Journal of Emerging Technologies, and the next is coming out in a few months from now. So the one I'll talk about is the legal framework for net positive social, environmental, and financial benefits, and Cora will talk about the coastal management tools. So while we developed offshore wind on the US ocean coast, so it's off the Atlantic, we have not done anything in the Great Lakes yet. This is complete infancy in terms of the Great Lakes. And none of the Great Lakes states have developed a comprehensive approach to evaluating offshore wind, or even identifying how they would lease the lake bed, how they would evaluate the environmental impacts and the conflicts with shipping, et cetera. So we have an opportunity now to craft a new legal framework to get out ahead of that. And we can review the federal government's role through BOEM, which is the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management. We can review their role on the oceans and highlight the non-price and price criteria that they use to evaluate and to select the projects that they're going to lease for offshore wind. We can also look to other countries. We discussed the Netherlands as a model, and we highlight policy questions for the Great Lakes states about leasing lake bed at this point before we get into actual proposals. So through our research, we're arguing that there's a legal framework that we need to evaluate Great Lakes offshore wind, and we should be focusing on setting up auctions, if we're going to have them, that are yielding net positive environmental and social benefits. And that would be informed by science, and that we're optimizing financial benefits through legal design choices about how we use the revenue. So I've mentioned this multiple times, but I'm going to just get a little more specific here, that there's an important distinction between the Great Lakes and the oceans in terms of legal jurisdiction. So on the oceans, the coastal states have jurisdiction from the coastline out 3 miles, and then it's the federal government. And most of these offshore wind facilities are at least 10 miles out. So that's why the federal government has been very, very prominent on the oceans. In the Great Lakes states, the entire lake bed up to the political boundaries between the states is under the jurisdiction of each state. They are supposed to be governing it through their public trust doctrine, holding it in trust for public uses, mainly for fishing, commerce, and natural resource enjoyment. So the public trust doctrine is something that we write about quite extensively in our research here, and we think needs to inform any kind of legal framework. As I mentioned on the oceans, it's BOEM that has jurisdiction. So we look to BOEM to see what has happened. This is a chart of all of the different steps in assessing a wind project on the oceans. So you can see that it takes many different points, and all of this is governed by BOEM. So we would either need to recreate this kind of structure for each individual Great Lakes state, or come up with a regional body that would be involved in this kind of in-depth assessment before anything would be allowed on the lakes. So one of the things we looked into with the ocean offshore wind was the auctions and the leasing that has happened. We compiled all of the federal offshore wind leases from the very first one through August of 2023, and looked at the amount of money that was generated from the leases. The real money is in the bonuses on these leases, and you'll see that the bonus money has risen over time on the Atlantic Ocean. We've got bonuses over $100 million and even $1 billion. The West Coast leases just opened up with $100 million bonuses, even though the floating wind technology doesn't exist, isn't ready to be deployed there yet, and they're still getting bonuses that large.
And Melissa, can you explain just the bonus a little bit? That's money that goes to the company.
No, it's money that the company pays to the government.
Okay.
So in order to obtain the lease, they pay a bonus that when they bid on there will be a bidding process where the private companies say this is how much we're gonna pay for this area that we will be leasing, and they compete with each other. They don't know what other companies are putting in as the bonus. So that's a great question. So then the federal government takes in this money, and we are looking at this and saying, well, what does that mean about structuring leases for the Great Lakes if we were to do that? And that's quite a bit of money that's coming in bonuses. What happens with it? And we looked at models for how to use public trust generated revenues, because that's what that would be if you're leasing lake bed, you're leasing public lands for a private purpose, and generating revenues. We looked at Pennsylvania, Alaska, and Ohio as different models for this. And in Pennsylvania, they reinvest all of their oil and gas and other natural resource leases, which they consider all part of their public trust in Pennsylvania. And they reinvest those into natural resource management. In Alaska, the money that's generated through the permanent fund leasing is distributed to individuals as dividends. Just every citizen in Alaska gets money. And in Ohio, the way they've structured their leasing is they take money into the state government and then they divvy it up between the local government at the project site and into coastal management. So different design choices that would need to be made by any state or region that is thinking about leasing Great Lakes lake bed, is how you set up an auction to generate the most money for the public, and then how you use that money. What is it going to be used for? Another element in the selection of these auctions can be non-price criteria, and we write about this in our research, that this is a very key piece of the legal design, is to put in criteria that is not about the bonuses or how much money a private company is willing to pay to get the lease, but what are they going to do to make sure that the environment is enhanced? What are they going to do to make sure that there are some kind of societal benefits, like people employed in the location where this is going in? If you don't think about it in advance, this won't be part of the legal design. But we have examples from other places that have done this. In the Netherlands, we hold out as a model for how to use non-price criteria in order to generate projects where it's kind of a race to the top, and you're finding the best projects based on the criteria that is in the law. So an example from the Netherlands is in the bidding for a project site, the companies have to show how they are going to contribute to the ecology of the North Sea. And there've been a lot of designs, and there's ongoing research now about creating turbine reefs in the North Sea through these projects. And these are criteria that could be very robust depending on how they're established, who's involved in establishing them. Do you have scientists who are actually informing the establishment of the criteria? And these are all legal design choices that we have the opportunity to think about, research, and perhaps implement if any states are going to move forward with this. Another legal design choice is, do we create a regional body, or does each state go it alone? And I have Lake Michigan here to show the 4 states around Lake Michigan. If each state is going it alone, you're potentially going to have conflicts between the states because the boundaries get pretty mushy down around the bottom of the lake. And there are a lot of considerations in terms of the efficiencies of planning for shared use of these waters. Each state is competing with one another and not actually collaborating over this. There could be problems with that. There could be delays through collaboration though, and there could be problems with different competing politics amongst the states that would prevent any kind of regional collaboration. So there are choices that need to be made about how to proceed, and they have to do with the level of governance that is going to work well for the Great Lakes. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Cora, because I've been talking mainly about the future and legal frameworks that need to be developed, and Cora is going to talk about some tools that we already had in place through coastal zoning that could be used to assess and do some initial planning on this.
So like Melissa said, I'm going to talk about coastal planning tools that already exist right now. And first I'll talk about the Coastal Zone Management Act, which is a federal law. Then I'll talk about the two state level case studies that we looked into, Ohio and Rhode Island, and talk about the role of regulatory clarity and the role of clean and renewable energy goals in an offshore wind project reaching its final stages and eventually operating. I'll talk a little bit more about regional collaboratives and then identify sort of all the research questions that we have moving forward and wrap up with our NSF workshop. So the Coastal Zone Management Act, again, this is a federal law, and there are a couple different pieces to this law. But under the CZMA, coastal states, which includes ocean coastal states and Great Lakes coastal states, can create a management program for the coastal zone in their state. And once they create this program and NOAA approves the program, makes sure that it includes the components that the federal law requires, the federal government must be consistent with that program. And that's a really big deal. It gives power to these states that they wouldn't otherwise have had over their coastal zone. And so this federal consistency piece, once a state's program has been approved, and every coastal state except I think Alaska currently participates in this program. So that includes all 8 Great Lakes states. Once that program is approved by the federal government, federal actions that may impact the coastal zone, they don't even have to be taking place in the coastal zone, must be consistent with that program to the maximum extent practicable. And federal actions doesn't necessarily just mean like a physical action that the government is doing. It also includes leasing and permitting, authorizations and funding. And so even though we don't have the federal government running the show for offshore wind in the Great Lakes, there are still other components where the federal government would be involved. And so it's important to understand this federal consistency piece. And I'll talk a little bit more about this in a bit. Another piece of the Coastal Zone Management Act is the Coastal Zone Enhancement Program, and this helps states enhance their management program over time with some funding opportunities to help them do that. There's also a Special Area Management Plan, or a SAMP. This is a tool that's a comprehensive, in-depth planning tool to identify specific actions that can be taken in either a specific geography or on a certain topic in a state's coastal zone. And so I'm going to talk about what Rhode Island did with their ocean SAMP for offshore wind. So let's look at these two case studies from Ohio and Rhode Island. The Rhode Island Block Island Wind Farm is a unique case in the oceans because, like Melissa said, most projects are in federal waters. And so that's a big difference from the Great Lakes. But this Block Island project actually was in Rhode Island state waters. And so it provides an especially applicable analogy to the Great Lakes region, where currently everything would be happening at the state level. The federal government, like I said, isn't running the show. So in Ohio, This icebreaker project would have been located in Lake Erie, 8 miles off the coast of Cleveland, like Melissa said. There are no turbines currently operating in the Great Lakes. This project was indefinitely paused after many delays last December. In contrast, the Block Island Wind Farm in Rhode Island was operational as of December 2016. And these projects originated around the same time, around 2009. So that's an important difference, and we want to understand the two different stories happening with these two different projects. In Ohio, the Coastal Management Office and the Ohio DNR created suitability maps of the Ohio portion of Lake Erie. So they looked at navigation channels and fishing areas and species, migration patterns, wind speeds, things like that, tried to overlay that on a map of the Ohio portion of Lake Erie to identify, oh, this is a place where, you know, we can put an offshore wind turbine. This is a place where that wouldn't make sense because it's a navigation channel. However, they did not have an in-depth comprehensive plan, quite like Rhode Island did. Rhode Island used this coastal tool, like I mentioned, the Special Area Management Plan, and had stakeholder input and various agencies working together to create this more in-depth and comprehensive plan for other issues, but largely offshore wind as well in their state waters. So that's an important difference between these two stories. Another important difference were the legal challenges in these two stories. So the icebreaker project faced multiple lengthy legal challenges related to environmental reviews, and that's expensive. And even though the developers ultimately won those cases, that's cited as one of the reasons that they, you know, have indefinitely paused this project. And we don't really know if that means, you know, the project will be picked up again or not. That's just sort of a terminology that they're going with for right now. In contrast, in Rhode Island, there were some legal challenges associated with the project, but they weren't based on environmental conflicts and they were resolved quicker. So again, an important difference because, like we've seen, even if the developer is winning these challenges, that doesn't necessarily equate to the project completion. Finally, an important difference between these two projects were the energy goals in the state of Ohio and the state of Rhode Island. In Ohio, across the lifetime of this project, energy goals were inconsistent. So initially there was, you know, an alternative renewable energy goal, and then 2 years later, you know, due to politics, that goal was reversed, and then just sort of some flip-flopping over the lifespan of this project. In contrast, in Rhode Island, energy goals were consistent and relatively aggressive across the lifespan of this project. So just to summarize these important takeaways, Block Island was completed. That started generating electricity. The icebreaker project in Ohio was not completed. And so we want to understand why. It seems like regulatory clarity and legal frameworks play an important role in why this happened, as well as clean and renewable energy goals. So to talk a little bit more about clean and renewable energy goals, Melissa mentioned the Netherlands as one example that we're highlighting. The Netherlands has a zero carbon by 2050 goal, but more importantly, they also have a specific carve out for offshore wind, not just clean energy broadly, but specific to offshore wind. 21 gigawatts of offshore wind capacity by 2032. And Melissa mentioned the federal government also has that offshore wind carve out, but like we said, the federal government isn't deploying wind in the Great Lakes. Maryland is another example that we've been looking at, and a state law called for 1.2 gigawatts of offshore wind in that state. And by the end of last year, the pipeline for projects had already surpassed that goal. So the specific offshore wind targets are important in addition to clean energy goals generally. Here in the Great Lakes region, all 8, like Melissa mentioned, states have some kind of clean or renewable or alternative energy goal. There's a wide variety of kind of what that means across the 8 different states, but 5 of the states have a goal to achieve 100% clean or renewable energy by 2040 or 2050. And these states have large population centers, and that's not an easy fix. And so that's why this these two things, decarbonization and Great Lakes offshore wind, may help each other. Melissa mentioned regional governance. Again, it's kind of a spectrum of what could be useful or what may happen with regional collaboration, whether that's like a regional governing body or just less with less authority, but still collaborating between states in the region. So one example to take a look at are regional ocean partnerships happening on the ocean coasts. In 2022, a funding law for these regional ocean partnerships, which are already existing and working on different issues, including offshore wind, it acknowledged that maybe the Great Lakes could have a regional partnership like those regional ocean partnerships. And these partnerships exchange information and coordinate data and research efforts. There's an example of the offshore wind subtopic for one of these partnerships here. That would be creating something new. In contrast, an existing group may choose to pick this issue up in the region. The Great Lakes Commission does a lot of important work in the region and previously has done work on offshore wind in the Great Lakes, but that's over 10 years ago now at this point, and wind isn't currently one of their top priorities that they've identified for the year. And so just thinking of our different options and what makes sense. So wrapping up with these research questions that we have, we've kind of been weaving them throughout the talk, but just to highlight them once more, Melissa talked about the public trust doctrine and the fact that the Great Lakes states hold the lake bed in trust for all of us because we're the public. What kind of auction criteria are most consistent with those trust responsibilities? Do the states in the region need to seek high revenues for trusting this lake bed that belongs to all of us and getting like a fair return on this public resource for the benefit of the public? And then how should states be spending that revenue according to the public trust? And we looked at different versions of states between Pennsylvania and Alaska and Ohio. Like every state also has their own variations on the public trust doctrine. And so it is important to understand how every state might vary, but the same theme is there, that states have obligations under the public trust. We talked about regional governance, and I mentioned the spectrum of whether that's like a leasing body kind of on one end of the spectrum that would mimic BOEM, the federal agency that operates in the oceans, or maybe it's more information sharing, data sharing, collaboration on research, but there are different pros and cons to where one might be on that spectrum. And like Melissa said, does it make sense to organize a region by all 8 states or all 5 lakes, or would it make more sense for the 4 states on Lake Michigan to come together and kind of operate in Lake Michigan itself, because New York and Minnesota don't necessarily need to be involved in Lake Michigan planning, right? I identified federal consistency review under the CZMA and why that's important to understand. States could impede development in neighboring states' jurisdictions under this doctrine, and so it'd be important to understand how that might help or hinder development in the region. And then finally, what are some benefits and burdens to a Great Lakes state recreating this in-depth comprehensive planning tool, this SAMP, like Rhode Island did? Comprehensive in-depth planning may help avoid some legal challenges like Ohio faced. On the flip side, it's resource intensive. It takes a lot of time and energy to do that kind of planning. So understanding the trade-offs for that kind of planning. Finally, I'm just going to wrap up with some takeaways from our NSF conference that Melissa started us off with. There are challenges to this industry that was evident in questions about floating wind and how does freshwater ice form compared to saltwater ice and things of that nature. We talked a lot about legal and regulatory challenges that will need to be identified if this resource is going to be pursued by the region. There are a lot of unknowns. One example being the vessels and materials needed for this sort of infrastructure build aren't necessarily compatible with the St. Lawrence Seaway. So how are we going to get those materials into this region? That being said, there's also a lot of momentum coming out of this workshop. It seemed like every person who spoke on their reflections of the workshop felt it was worthwhile and felt a lot of energy to kind of keep this moving forward. And okay, we've identified these research questions, how can we collaborate moving forward to start answering some of these questions and overcoming some of these challenges? And then finally, it's clear that there is an opportunity here. As Melissa said, we have choices to design how we do this and maybe maximize that opportunity to decarbonize this region. And there are other opportunities like workforce development. There's currently a contract in Sturgeon Bay, Wisconsin to build one of these large vessels to install offshore wind on the oceans. And so there's an opportunity to bring that pairing back to our region as well. And with that, I think we can open it up for any questions that folks might have.
We are going to start with the students. People with questions.
So, we all know how valuable the Great Lakes are to people that live around the Great Lakes. But there are other interests worldwide in the Great Lakes. As far as national security, what conversations do you have around adding, our energy sources to the Great Lakes, as like adding, wind resources, renewable resources to the Great Lakes, increasing that target that we might have? Terrorism, national security. Is there ever conversation on that you're talking about?
That did not come up in any of the workshop conversations. I'm not sure that there would be, are you thinking there would be a greater national security risk to that than, say, an Oak Creek power plant?
I mean, just in general, since our lakes are such a huge resource for our drinking water, that puts us at a higher risk in the area by adding our energy there. I don't know. It's just that.
Okay. All right. No, I appreciate the thought. It didn't come up, but it's good to give these presentations. People's reactions to it. I would say just my gut reaction to that, on the drinking water side of things, we need to think about like the coal ash adjacent to the lake and eventually depositing into the lake when there are accidents. We've had actual drinking water contamination problems from our existing fossil fuel infrastructure. So I don't know if there would be a greater risk, but that could be another question of evaluating what the risks are of different energy choices.
With thinking about like the wind on the Great Lakes and a partnership with all 4 of the states, if that were to happen, how would the revenue be split? Because obviously Wisconsin and Michigan have a lot more shoreline than Illinois and Indiana. So would that be split proportionally, or like same with like the responsibility for like upkeep of the windmills?
Yeah, I think those would be part of the questions that need to be answered when you're creating that kind of legal framework. One of the questions from the outset too that people at the workshop were saying was, why would the states even collaborate? Because aren't they going to be competing for these businesses to come, set up shop essentially in their waters? And so, yeah, how the jurisdictional lines are set. So you could kind of make some easy choices of, if it's on the Wisconsin side of the line, it's Wisconsin's revenues, but you're all following the same framework of how you'll be evaluating these proposals and collaborating with each other, and maybe you choose to give review authority to your adjacent states. I don't know. These are the types of questions that would need to be answered.
One of the ways to facilitate potentially how the revenue sharing would occur is, the question is, what power pool region are the states in? Because they're going to develop where they can get the distribution where it's needed, and that has to trade off with whatever existing natural gas plants there are, because when the wind doesn't blow, those need to pick up. So the power pool and how they are distributed, and I have no idea. will matter, but as a good example of the natural, the security risk, the Project XL pipeline goes into Cushing, Oklahoma, and you do actually get there by accident. It is considered a potential target because it's where a lot of oil is stored before it gets to the strategic reserve in Louisiana. And it's a crossroads of all the oil pipelines. So I was rather dismayed after 9/11 to move to a place that did have a target. I thought I was safe in the middle of nowhere.
Yeah, so since the Great Lakes Board of Canada, is this something that their government would also have to like weigh in on?
Sure, that's a good question. So I mean, there's nothing stopping us from collaborating together, in expanding our regional approach, not only to the 8 states, but also to the 2 different, countries and including federally recognized tribes and other entities like in this, effort. That being said, like Canada couldn't stop the state of Wisconsin from offshore wind turbines in the lake. The Lake Erie project off the coast of Ohio, that was fully leased and authorized with various permits from the state and federal government, and Canada doesn't have to necessarily sign off on that. Right now in Canada, there's actually a moratorium on offshore wind development. They're not really exploring it at the moment, but that's a good question.
Well, we do have experience collaborating with our neighbors to the north, on the Great Lakes, so it would be interesting to look at the Great Lakes Compact and Agreement, where we have worked, continue to work with the Canadian provinces on co-management of the Great Lakes, and it would be, I think that's a model for maybe approaching how we would engage around this topic as well.
Jim, maybe?
I'm sure, I'm just curious on that, are there particular states that are actually interested in pursuing this? Is Wisconsin interested in pursuing this? And, would this be typical wind installation, say on the East Coast, be driven by state policy, or is it driven by a city? More at the scale of it, not thinking who the customer is it really the state versus the city, or is it the regional utility that be driving?
Yeah, so on the oceans on the East Coast, there have been state policies that have encouraged offshore wind and regional collaborations around offshore wind consortiums amongst the states in the Atlantic seaboard. And that was part of the research that Cora was talking about with the Coastal Zone Management Act. In terms of the states within the Great Lakes region that seem most interested, around like 2010-ish, Wisconsin did evaluate this through our Public Service Commission. So there were maybe 100 people who were on a study commission looking at this. And then there was an election, you might remember, in around that time. And nothing has happened since then. Now, in Illinois, there are several legislators in Illinois who keep bringing up wanting to promote offshore wind and actually site turbines off the coast of the south side of Chicago. I don't know how realistic that is. And then Ohio, of course, has had its saga with the icebreaker wind project. New York has kind of gone back and forth with a love-hate relationship with the concept of offshore wind. They had a study commission, and they also came out and said, we're not doing this right now. So it's all over the map. Michigan had a study commission about 10 years ago, and nothing has happened. So it's been quite variable.
Yeah, I've got a little clarification that Rhode Island facility was built, that involving an actual island that was offshore?
Yes, that is like a funny irony of this project in Rhode Island, which isn't an island, but then the Block Island Wind Farm in Rhode Island is on an island, so yeah, thank you for bringing that up, yes, and that's part of why, that pilot project is uniquely positioned in state waters, because even though from the mainland, it's more than 3 miles off the shore, and that would be federal jurisdiction, Block Island is that far off the mainland, and it's within 3 miles of that piece of state land, and so that's why it's a state jurisdiction.
So it was actual offshore, it wasn't actually on the island.
Right, yes, exactly, it was in the, like, ocean floor, rather than on the land of that
Right.
land.
Yeah, do you know, are these proposals all talking about floating platforms, or are they also talking about like anchored?
They're anchored. And part of the technology challenge for the Great Lakes that we learned from one of the companies that is doing this on the oceans is that they don't consider the Great Lakes a possible place for them until there's floating platform technology because of the depths and the distance that they would need to be offshore to minimize conflicts.
The mid-lake region, those are they're pretty sensitive areas as far as fish spawning. I mean, you think that would really be a place for.
Yeah, so that's, the more we heard from the technology group at this workshop, the more like this does not seem like it's in the near future, because we still need to develop the technology. And we're very, very focused on the legal structure, and that all seems very, it's all like, it would take a long time and a lot of leadership to answer these questions well in a way that actually protects the environment and the public. And then the technology piece of it is just a whole nother host of issues that need to be, I guess, not just addressed, but solved, in order for this to move forward.
Laura, you were talking about the environmental legal challenges that were almost Pyrrhic victories. Can you just elaborate more on what were those challenges done in good faith?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. Thank you for asking that. The legal challenges had to do with different bird species that either migrate or breed around the lake or through the lake. And there was a lot of back and forth with the Ohio entity that grants the lease to the developer for that little section of, the lake bed, initially requiring, the turbines to shut off for certain parts of the day or season, that would align with protecting those species in theory. But the good faith question is maybe an important component of this. There was some of the challengers to this project were funded by fossil fuel funds. And so there are some coalitions coming together that maybe on its surface, we want to be mindful of bird species that migrate across the lake, of course, and that's what we're trying to identify and make legal design choices that do just that. But just because somebody challenges a permit on those grounds doesn't necessarily mean that they're really representing the true interests or that the science is reflected.
I want to follow up on that because I come from Nashville and we got very close to a metro plan. And there was like a public vote, and then the Koch brothers suddenly started funding opposition research for trains in Nashville, Tennessee. Are there any places along the development for wind farms that might be vulnerable to kind of national politics or anything related to the Great Lakes?
Yes, I would think so, in the sense that, so the Koch brothers were the entity that funded these challenges. And so I think, we talked about the maybe pros and cons of regional collaboration, and one con might be, a certain state and state politics getting in the way of another state who wants to pursue this clean energy resource. And so, yeah, just assessing those trade-offs is challenging. Because there could be a lot of benefit to regional collaboration. Melissa mentioned there's already that collaboration that's happening, like with drinking water and the Great Lakes Compact, but you know, could that all come together in an effective way on this like shortened time frame that we're trying to decarbonize the economy? I don't know.
Last question, Javi, do you have a question?
I was just wondering, there's a number of miles per offshore wind. Is there anything you learned from, there's been a lot of terrestrial. Is there anything to be learned from them as far as, you know, how you benefits?
We didn't look at that in our research. I can respond to that. And then did you have something to respond to that as well?
Oh, yeah.
Tracy? Okay. So the one thing that we didn't look at that specifically, but we did learn from practitioners who were involved in the Ohio Icebreaker project about their main takeaways related to making sure that stakeholders are involved as early as possible before there's a proposal. And when you're even just considering, are we going to pursue this part of the energy mix? You know, we have a lot of different energy choices for renewables, and and all of them have trade-offs. And so involving the public in assessing those trade-offs seems like a pretty good idea in terms of making some choices about how we're investing in this infrastructure change that is really monumental that we're all living through, and also extremely complicated. Hence the workshop, and the workshop just articulates, even crystallizes how complicated this is, but it also, I think the workshop participants, and judging by the answers in this room when we started this, we all know that our future really depends on figuring this out. We need to figure out the best way to produce renewable energy with the least amount of costs and the most benefits for the public. And that's like the challenge of our generation right now.
Yeah, we still have a couple
A
questions.
couple comments in the
Audience.
chat from Russell, and I'll read them out, and if you want to add anything to them. An interesting aspect of regional climate change relevant to this is mean wind speed and direction, assumed to be unimportant for floating platforms, but still a consideration because wind analyses were 10 years old and things are actively changing. And then the second comment there is, there was a pretty substantial coal ash slump into Lake Michigan at the Oak Creek plant, and the Water Institute's newspaper response was that it would be diluted out by a large volume quickly. So if there's anything to add to those comments.
Well, on the wind speed, I'm not going to comment on that. We have other people in the room who might want to comment on that. And one of the really cool aspects of being in this school is having the atmospheric science faculty and students here. And so going back to that initial water consulting course, we couldn't have done that project without having a student from the atmospheric sciences who came into the team and worked with the team all semester as one of the students and did the wind analysis. So each person on the team contributed a unique skill set, and that one was so valuable because none of the other students could replicate that. The comment about Oak Creek that references the ash pile, which I was talking about earlier as well. I don't know what the school's response was. I wasn't here at that point, so can't comment on that.
That's all.
I think so.
Okay, thank you very much. And